Well, hello again, folks. I think it's about time we do another lecture video. Um, we're wrapping up the lecture series about the organ systems that are of the four primary tissue types. We've done epithelial tissue and the integumentary system. We've done connective tissue in the bones. We've done muscle tissue and the muscle system. Now we've got one more that we need to look at. And so let's go ahead and look at the one system that's vaguely unsettled, but relatively confident it can still get the job done. You probably know it as the nervous system. All right, so we've got a few videos that we're going to look at with the nervous system. This first one we're going to look at is specifically nervous tissue and the individual cells. Then we'll get into some of the function in the next video, and then we'll round it out with some anatomy, and we'll focus on the brain and the spinal cord and stuff like that. So let's start off with our introduction to the nervous system. Now, the nervous system is various organs, including the brain and the spinal cord. The receptor organs, like your eyes and your ears and stuff like that, and all the nerves that connect all the various other systems. So like those motor neurons that we talked about in the muscle system, for example. Nervous tissue has two types of cells. The first one are neurons, the nerve cells that are used for communication from cells to cells. That's intercellular communication. And neuroglia, or the glial cells. And those are support cells, and they're essential to the survival and the function of the neurons and preserve the structure of the nervous tissue. Now, the nervous system itself can be divided into different divisions, sections, however you want to talk about it. We've got the central nervous system, that's brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is everything else in the body. Here's a diagram showing us how we break up the different systems. The first one we'll talk about is the central nervous system, and that's the brain and the spinal cord. Now, we've also got connective tissue holding everything in place and blood vessels. It functions to process and coordinate data from inside and outside of the body, sensory data, so like what you see, what you feel, and stuff like that. It also controls motor function, those skeletal muscles that we had talked about from the muscle system unit, and higher functions of the brain, including memory and emotion, learning, stuff like that. Then we have the peripheral nervous system, and that's basically all the other nerves in the body. There's another division that we'll talk about briefly called the enteric nervous system. So basically all the nerves that aren't central or enteric. Motor neurons, for example. They deliver sensory information to the central nervous system and carry motor commands back to whatever particular tissues need to be controlled. We've got nerves or peripheral nerves in here are bundles of axons, and we'll get into that in just a little bit, with connective tissue and blood vessels. They carry sensory information to the brain and then motor commands away from the brain. We've got cranial nerves. So let me write that one down. We've got cranial nerves, which are the ones that are connecting the brain all together. And we've got spinal nerves, and those are the ones that are related to the spinal cord, either making it up or attached to it. Functional divisions of the peripheral nervous system include the afferent division right here, and so that's the part that's bringing sensory information about the outside world to the brain. And then the efferent division is sending out commands from the central nervous system to the rest of the body. muscles, but also glands, and we'll talk about a little bit about that when we do the nervous system and other tissues. Then we have the receptors and effectors. So it's these sections right here. Receptors are like your sensors. Okay, they're going to detect changes or responses to stimuli. They could be neurons themselves or nerve cells, like some of them that are in your hands and your skin that for touch. Or they can be specialized cells like cells in your eyes or in your ears. In your nose and your mouth, those are very similar. And then there's a special senses video. I don't think I mentioned that at the beginning that we'll talk about also. So it goes into a lot of detail about vision and hearing and stuff like that. And then the effectors, those are the ones that are associated with the motor commands. So if you're trying to swat a fly or scratch an itch, or like a reflex, you're jerking your hand away from something hot, then your signal is going to travel down the efferent division to the effectors, and so the actual action is going to take place. That's going to be kind of important when we talk about feedback loops in a little while, about receptors and effectors and stuff like that. Effectors are the ones that are going to be doing whatever action that the body is responding to. Some other divisions, within the peripheral nervous system, we can actually divide the efferent division into two separate divisions. Now, those are the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system, which is this one right here, is going to control the skeletal muscles, and so that's voluntary control, but it's also going to have involuntary control, that's reflexes. The classic dodgeball example, if someone's throwing a ball at your face and you flinch, that's a reflex. That's involuntary. Versus a voluntary response, you see the ball coming towards you, so you raise your hands up to catch it. Then we have the autonomic nervous system, and these are all the unconscious actions. Smooth muscle contraction, breathing, cardiac muscle contractions, stuff like that. So these are all the things that you don't control. Now within that you've got different systems, right? So you have, let me back up. We've got parasympathetic, which is, here, I'll draw an arrow right there. So parasympathetic and sympathetic. Now, easy ways to think about these ones. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. That one has a relaxing effect. And the sympathetic nervous system, or the sympathetic division, is your fight or flight. Except I wrote fight, flight, or flight. So it's actually fight or flight. So that's the one, like your heart rate gets up and you start sweating and you have a lot of energy. And parasympathetic would be you just had a big meal, you want to digest it, so you're feeling kind of drowsy. I mentioned earlier that there's an enteric nervous system, and so the enteric nervous system is related to the digestive tract right there. And it works very similarly as what's going on in the brain and the spinal column. And it's focusing on visceral reflexes. So reflexes of the organs, right? So this phenomenon known as peristalsis, which is basically just the swallowing mechanism of your esophagus, the movement of your stomach while it's churning, other peristaltic contractions within your intestines moving things, secretion of digestive juices and stuff like that. So all of these happen, they're reflexes, they happen without any input from the central nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, however, can affect these, parasympathetic and sympathetic, right? If you've ever been really, really nervous, you probably don't have much of an appetite, and the enteric nervous system sort of gets suppressed in response to that. Okay, let's take a look at some of the actual cells that we have going on. So this is a neuron right here. Those are the basic functional units of the nervous system. They're responsible for sending and receiving signals. And you can see they look very, very different than some of the other cells that we've been looking at. And so they're going to receive information and send it on, or not. There's certain checkpoints, which you'll look at in the next video. Looking at some of the structures, let's look at one end. How about over here on this side? You have all these little craggly things that are sort of sticking out, almost like trees without the leaves and stuff like that. Those are our dendrites. They're short branch structures coming off of the cell body. That is this structure, this main blue structure right here. As you can see, it's known as the cell body. The main part of the cell, basically, is what we need to know. So the dendrites branch off of that, and that they are primarily responsible for receiving information. Okay, most of the surface area, coincidentally, 80 to 90%, are the dendrites right there. So very extensive branching. You've probably noticed this long orange structure right over here. That's known as the axon, this long part right here. It's a single long cytoplasmic process. Now remember, from bones we studied that word. A process in anatomy is a projection. Let me learn how to spell. Right, and so you can see it's this long projection coming off of the cell body right over here. And this is responsible for propagating electrical signals, right? We kind of mentioned those when we did the muscles. Those are known as our action potentials, right? And you're going to get into a whole lot of greater detail what that process actually means in the next video. Let's see. Let's keep on going. Other parts of the axon, specifically, we have something called the axolemma, which is the membrane of the axon. We also have the initial segment, which is, it's kind of hard to see, but this part right here is the initial segment. So it's the first part of the axon. Let's see, proximal to the cell body, in between the axon, it's the proper, and the cell body, is something known as the axon hillock. And so that's where the cell body is narrowing, and that's the point of attachment for the axon moving away from the cell. Okay, so let's see some other things. So we can classify neurons based on their structure, what they look at, right? So we've got four main ones that we're going to look at. The first one are anaxonic neurons. They are small. All the cell processes, so all those projections, look similar. They kind of all look like dendrites. There's no axon. Okay, and these are found primarily in the brain and special sense organs. And they can receive a lot of information and send it out sort of in all directions and stuff like that. Then the next one is the bipolar neuron. Now, they're not sometimes manically happy and crushingly depressed. They're called that because they have two axons with two sets of what looks like branches at the end. Now, they're slightly different. Like, these are dendritic branches. Those are axon terminals. So there's more branching in the dendritic branches. But as you can see, we've got two very long processes. One of them is technically the axon, and one of them is the dendrite. They're very, very small. They're very, very rare. And those are found primarily in your special sense organs for sight, your eyeballs, smell, your olfactory receptors, and hearing, your inner ear and stuff like that. We also have the unipolar neurons. The axon and the dendrite are fused, and so it kind of looks like there's just one. If you look at this right here, there's one axon with the cell body hanging off of it, almost like I don't know, like a rest stop or a gas station or something like that, sort of off of the highway. Most of the sensory neurons of the peripheral nervous system are unipolar. And then multipolar is the last one. Let's take a look at that one. They have a long axon and 2 or more dendrites. This is the sort of standard nerve cell that we always look at, right? So this is the standard nerve cell. They're very common in the central nervous system. All the motor neurons are these types of cells. And, well, that's it as far as the structure is concerned. Functional classifications, there's 3 different classifications. There's sensory neurons, there's motor neurons, and then there's interneurons. Sensory neurons, let's take a look at these. These are our afferent neurons, right? So if we go back and think about that diagram, afferent are going to bring info to the brain, okay? These are unipolar. They are, the cell bodies are grouped into ganglia. The processes extend from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system. We have different types of sensory neurons. We've got somatic neurons, which monitor the external environment. So these would be like, an example would be touch receptors, right? What else? Visceral sensory neurons are monitoring the internal environment. So these are going to, let's see, they're going to monitor temp, they're going to monitor blood pressure, what else? They're going to monitor the organs, right, if any damage has happened to them or anything like that. Learn how to spell again, Mr. Thompson. All right, types of sensory receptors. So these are the actual sensors that are detecting things. We have interoceptors, which are monitoring internal systems like digestive or urinary. So if you're sitting there and all of a sudden you feel like you have to go to the bathroom, or you're slowly feeling like you have to go to the bathroom, or you're thirsty, or you're hungry, or something like that, that is interoceptors. Exteroceptors are monitoring the external environment, so temperature receptors in the skin, your complex senses like sight, and then proprioceptors monitor position of the movement of the skeletal muscles in the joints. And so this is why you can try this. So you sit here like this, right? And you can touch your nose. Okay, I can touch my elbow. If I were to ask you to touch your right ear, you could touch your right ear, right? Now close your eyes and do all of that stuff, right? Okay, so I'm touching my nose. You can see my eyes are closed. I'm going to touch my elbows. I'm going to touch my ear. These are the sensors that help you determine where your body is in space. So even if you can't see, you still know where your parts are. So they can still coordinate effectively, which I think is pretty cool. Motor neurons, so these are your efferent neurons. So remember, afferent is taking in information, sending it to the brain. Efferent is from the brain to the, let's say, the muscles, okay? These are your commands that are going out. So they're going to carry instructions from the CNS to the peripheral effectors, the things that are actually going to be making the change. They use efferent fibers. We have somatic motor neurons, which innervate skeletal muscles. And innervate, all that means is they attach and regulate. Okay, that's what innervate means. They're also, no, that's pretty much it. The visceral motor neurons are going to do everything else. So they're going to innervate all other peripheral effectors like cardiac muscle, glands, adipose tissue. They're going to signals from the central nervous system to the visceral effectors, cross autonomic ganglia that divide axons into pre- and post-ganglionic fibers, depending on where they're located on that in relation to that bundle, basically. Interneurons are mostly in the brain and the spinal column. They are located between the sensory and motor neurons. So the sensory neurons are going to bring the information in. The motor neurons are going to take the commands out. The interneurons are that's the gap in between what's firing in your brain, sending signals in between different processing centers before those final instructions are sent out. Distributing sensory information, coordinating motor activity, and higher functions like memory, planning, learning, and stuff like that. So this is the functioning within your brain. Okay, so that was all neurons. Remember, the other part of the nervous system we talked about was the neuroglia. These support and protect the neurons. They make up half the volume of the nervous system. And there's a bunch of different types. We're going to talk about 4. The astrocytes, the ependymal cells, the oligodendrocytes, and the microglia. Let's start with the astrocytes first. The astrocytes maintain the blood-brain barrier, provide structural support, regulate different concentrations, repair damage, can create the three-dimensional framework, guide development, control interstitial environment. I don't know if I said that it maintains the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a protection wall, basically, that only allows certain things in. It's very effective, for example, at blocking like pathogens and poisons and stuff like that from getting from the body into the brain and the spinal column. And so these cells are responsible for making that. And they have very large cell bodies with many processes. That is these cells right here. And you can kind of see they have all of those little processes out, helping hold everything together, and serving as a sort of go-between for the outside world, which is these capillaries right here, and the inside world, which is this interstitial area with all the nerve cells are suspended in. Let's see, we have the ependymal cells. These line the ventricles of the brain. They form the epithelium that lines that lines the central canal and the ventricles. So the ventricles are spaces, fluid-filled spaces in your brain, and we'll look at that when we do the anatomy. They produce and monitor cerebrospinal fluid, which is important for maintaining brain health, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. And they have cilia that help circulate that. And so here is this central canal right here. These cells are the ependymal cells, and you can see, if you look really, really closely, the cilia that are all right here, kind of moving all that stuff around. Then we have the oligodendrocytes, and they're primarily providing structural framework. They have very small cell bodies with very few processes. This is an oligodendrocyte right here, and then it's got a couple of processes that are sort of holding these different sheaths together. They may cooperate to help create these sheaths with some other cells that we're going to talk about here in just a second. The myelin is like a fatty substance that wraps around the axons, that insulates them, speeds up action potentials, and when we do the brain dissections, parts of the brain look white. That's why you hear about gray matter and white matter. Gray matter are myelinated nerves. White matter is myelinated nerves. Gray matter is not. We have the microglia. Microglia are, they're tiny, kind of feather-like looking things. Here's a microglia right there. The microglia are very small and the least numerous. They have many fine branch processes. They are cleanup crew, basically. Clean up waste, debris, pathogens, stuff like that. Then we have the neuroglia of the peripheral nervous system. All those ones that we looked at here were all in the central nervous system, so brain and spinal column primarily. These are in all the other nerve cells, and we've got two types of cells. One of them is the satellite cells. Satellite cells surround the ganglia. They regulate concentrations of stuff, carbon dioxide, oxygen, ions, stuff like that. Neurotransmitter levels around the neurons and things like that. And then we have Schwann cells, which are primarily responsible for creating the myelin sheaths around the axons. And so very long axons will actually have several Schwann cells creating this myelin sheath. And there's these little exposed junctures that are really important in the propagation of action potentials. Here you can see the, so each one of these, so here is the nucleus of a Schwann cell. And so each one of these little cuffs, basically, is a Schwann cell. And so all of them collectively create the myelin sheath around this axon, which is this section right here. Here, let me clear that up. So there's this part, remember, and then these are the dendrites, right? And that's it. I mean, that's the highlights anyway. There's a whole lot more information about that, but this covers all the important stuff. Stay tuned, because we're going to do action potentials, graded potentials, and synapses, and how nerve cells actually send information. We're going to really talk about that whole process about nerve impulse transmission that we had briefly mentioned when we talked about the muscles. We're going to bring back synapses again, so have those, maybe review those notes that we looked at with the muscle contraction cycle. Then we'll get into the anatomy and stuff like that. We've got a dissection that we have coming up down the line that we'll look at. We've also got special senses, so like how do your eyes work, how do your ears work, why is it when your nose is stopped up you can't really taste anything, that sort of thing. And then at some point in the near future we'll also do the endocrine system, so hormones and stuff like that, basically. So if you have any questions, let me know. Ask me in class, send me a remind message, send me an email. Otherwise, thank y'all for joining me this time around, and I look forward to seeing y'all again soon.